Most of us are not and will never be experts on most things. So, what do you do when you want to find out information about something? Obviously, you ask Google. So, let's say I look like this, but I want to look like this. Now, I'm no fitness expert, but that's no big deal because Google is. So, I'll just ask Google, what is the best way to gain muscle fast? So here are just some of the results from my Google search. And as you can see, I now almost have the opposite problem. I have way too much information, and some of it is even conflicting. For example, here it says, eat more protein. And then another website said, no, don't fear carbs. Some websites focused on taking supplements, pre-gaming properly. And then another one said, no, actually, stop relying on supplements. Some focused on the actual amount of weight you were lifting or the type of weights, like doing drop sets, progressive overload, compound exercises, focusing on the eccentric phase of a lift. And here, my personal favorite, it said just go to bed 30 minutes earlier. So after sorting through all of this information, I feel more confused than ever. How can I decide which information is real and which is just BS? Now here's where I want you to keep in mind that not all information is created equally. And one of the best ways to critically analyze information we receive is to go back to the source of that information, and more specifically, to look at the methods that were used to obtain that information. In other words, how was it tested? When the information we are receiving is reliable, we should be able to go back to the source and look at the test or experiment that was used to analyze or obtain that information. And we should be able to find that a good experiment or a good test will have some basic characteristics that we can identify. It should test the effect of one and only one variable on the outcome of the experiment. It will strive to minimize bias, and it will use statistical analysis to estimate the significance of the result. So let's look at each of these in a little more detail. So I just told you that a good experiment will test the effect of one variable on the outcome. But what is a variable? A variable is simply something that you change or vary in your experiment. So we could choose any of the things we found on Google to be our variable. For example, we might be interested in trying out drop sets. Now, drop sets are simply where you start out lifting a heavy weight, and then you switch down to a lower weight and continue your reps. So now we have designed an experiment in which our one variable is drop sets, and the outcome we are measuring is muscle growth. In science, we call this single variable that we're testing the independent variable, and our outcome, or the thing we are measuring, is referred to as the dependent variable because it's dependent on the variable that we're testing. Now, let's say that I wanted to try doing drop sets, but I'm also interested in doing occlusion training. Occlusion training is this new trend where you tie something around a body part to restrict the blood flow to the muscle group that's being exercised. Now, why would it be bad to do both of these things at the same time? The reason we do not want to test more than one variable at a time is because there's no way to tell if the end result can be attributed to drop sets, occlusion training, or both. Even though my end result is larger muscles, it could be that just one of these variables contributed to that and the other one is total BS. But the experiment I designed will never be able to tell me that. Now, I also told you that a good experiment will strive to minimize bias. But what is bias? Bias is essentially an expectation or an idea about how you, as the experimenter, or the people participating in the experiment, in other words, the volunteers, have about how the outcome will turn out. And it's important to make every effort to minimize bias because our expectations can actually alter the outcome or our interpretation of the outcome of our experiment. When this happens, we call it the placebo effect. Imagine that you work for a company that manufactures HMB, which stands for beta-hydroxy beta-methylbutyrate, and you want to run an experiment to test the effect of supplementing with this drug on muscle growth. So in this case, our independent variable, or the one we are testing, is the HMB supplement. And again, our outcome, or our dependent variable, will be muscle growth. Now, supplementing with HMB is supposed to prevent the breakdown of muscle protein. And because you work for the company and you want this drug to be successful, you have an inherent bias that this drug is going to work, or you want the experiment to turn out in a particular way. So let's say you design an experiment in which you have 4 random volunteers and you decide to give HMB to half of them. This will be your experimental group, and you decide to give nothing to the other group. This is known as your control group. Why is this a bad design? This is a bad design because the volunteers that got HMB might believe that their workouts are now going to be more effective, while the volunteers that got nothing will know that nothing's going to change. This knowledge might inadvertently motivate or demotivate your participants, making it seem like the HMB is working, when in reality it just might be the volunteer's motivation level making the difference. Additionally, because you are biased in favor of HMB, you might interpret the results of your experimental group more favorably. A better way to run this experiment would be to find a way to not only minimize our own bias, but the bias of our volunteers as well. So how can we go about eliminating the bias in our experiment? The best way to do this would be to design an experiment in which our experimental group still receives the HMB supplement. However, instead of giving our control group nothing, this time we'll give them a placebo. And in this case, a placebo would simply be another pill that looks exactly like the HMB supplement. Most importantly, you do not tell each volunteer whether they are receiving the real or the fake supplement. And in this way, you can eliminate volunteer bias. We call this a blind study. But there's still one problem, and that is that you have not yet eliminated your own bias. The solution to this is to blind the experimenter as well. So neither the experimenter nor the volunteers know who is in the experimental or the control group. We call this a double-blind study, and it is an effective way to eliminate all bias from your experiment. Now that we have designed a good experiment by testing only one variable and eliminating the bias, we are ready to run our experiment and interpret our results. However, how will we know if any differences we see between the experimental and the control group are truly the result of the HMB supplement increasing muscle growth, and not just differences that arise by random chance? For example, let's say that only one of our volunteers gains muscle. Can we interpret this to mean that HMB works? Or let's say that both of the volunteers taking HMB gain muscle, but this time one of the volunteers from our control group gains even more muscle. Can we interpret this to mean that HMB does or doesn't increase muscle gains? From the data we have collected, we likely conclude that we can't draw any of these conclusions. because our sample size was too small, meaning that we did not test enough people to distinguish between real differences and differences caused by chance. A well-designed experiment will use a large rather than a small sample size, maybe putting 50 or even 100 people into each group rather than 2, as we did in our previous example. Additionally, a good experiment will categorize the results and analyze them using statistical methods to determine if any differences observed between the control and the experimental group are real differences or may simply have been caused by random chance. Now, I am not an expert on fitness, but when faced with a plethora of information, the best way to determine what's real from what's BS is to go back to the source of the information, which is usually listed somewhere on the bottom of the web page. And if you go back to the source and take a look at how their experiments were designed, you can determine for yourself whether you feel that information is reliable or total BS.